You wake before dawn in silk sheets dyed the color of royalty, but your hands won't stop trembling. The servants arrived an hour ago with cosmetics and oils, their faces carefully empty of expression. Your mother has been sitting in the corner, watching you dress, and she hasn't spoken a single word. You're 13 years old. You're a princess of the most powerful empire on earth, and tonight your father has summoned you to his chambers. The moment you understood what those words actually meant, something inside you began breaking in ways you don't yet have language to describe. Now the eunuch is at the door, his voice flat and ceremonial, and your childhood is about to end in a room you've never entered. At the hands of a man who should have protected you from the entire world. Before we go any deeper into this, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I'm still amazed that stories from ancient Persia reach people in every time zone, every continent, hungry to understand what power really looked like when nothing constrained it. This is Persepolis in 476 BCE, 9 years into the reign of Xerxes, king of kings. The man who ruled from the Aegean to the borders of India. The girl being prepared that morning was named Amestris, though that name appeared so often in royal households that historians sometimes struggle to separate one princess from another. What doesn't get confused, what appears consistently across Greek accounts and fragmentary Persian records, is what happened to daughters born into Xerxes' household once they reached puberty. The practice was documented. It was discussed at court without apparent shame. And it reveals something about absolute power that makes us deeply uncomfortable, precisely because it shows how systems can normalize the unspeakable when those systems exist to serve the desires of a single man who believes himself closer to God than to human. Xerxes inherited more than an empire when his father Darius died in 486 BCE. He inherited a template for kingship that treated family bonds as fundamentally different from the bonds ordinary people experienced. Persian kings claimed descent from Ahura Mazda himself, which meant royal blood carried divine essence that needed to be preserved, concentrated, kept pure through unions that would horrify anyone outside the palace walls. Siblings married siblings, fathers claimed daughters. The justification was always the same. Divine blood must not be diluted with common blood, and who possessed purer royal essence than the king's own children. But beneath the religious language, beneath the talk of sacred bloodlines and divine mandate, was something far more primal and far more disturbing. It was about demonstrating that literally no one existed beyond the king's reach, that even the most intimate family bonds meant nothing when set against royal desire, that daughters were property before they were children, assets before they were people with their own interior lives. The harem Xerxes, maintained at Persepolis, housed over 600 women, according to Greek sources, though that number may include exaggeration shaped by their horror at Persian customs. What isn't exaggerated is that among those women were his own daughters, brought into his chambers once they reached sexual maturity, used in ways that Greek historians recorded with fascination and revulsion. Treated identically to concubines, or captured slaves or tribute offerings from conquered peoples. Some daughters were summoned once or twice and then married off to nobles as political rewards. Others became regular features in their father's rotation, called to his chambers repeatedly over months or years. Their childhoods ending not gradually, but in a single night that severed them from innocence permanently. The system had its own rituals, its own careful procedures that palace servants followed with the precision of religious ceremony, as if elaborate preparation could somehow transform violation into something sanctified. When a daughter's time came, usually around her 13th birthday, She would be taken to the bathhouse, where female servants scrubbed her skin until it glowed, removed every trace of body hair, applied perfumed oils that made her smell like the expensive trade goods that flowed into Persepolis from across the empire. Her hair would be arranged in styles the king preferred. Cosmetics would be applied to make her appear older, more developed, to create the illusion that this was a woman rather than a child being prepared for her father's pleasure. She would be dressed in silk that revealed more than it concealed, jewelry heavy enough to remind her of her status, even as that status offered her no protection whatsoever. Then a eunuch would arrive, someone she had known her entire life, someone who had perhaps given her gifts on festival days when she was younger, but who now looked at her with eyes that held no recognition of previous relationship. Only the flat assessment of someone evaluating property for fitness to purpose. The walk through palace corridors to her father's private chambers became a journey every daughter remembered with crystalline clarity for the rest of her life. The cool stone beneath her feet, the flickering torches that cast shadows, making the reliefs of conquered peoples seem to move and writhe, the sound of her own breathing growing faster, despite her desperate attempts to maintain the composure that had been drilled into her since birth. Some daughters were accompanied by their mothers to the threshold, then left to enter alone. Others made the journey with only the eunuch as guide, their mothers having already learned that witnessing your daughter's delivery to this fate without being able to prevent it was its own special torture. At the door, the eunuch would announce her, then withdraw, and the daughter would step into chambers decorated with every luxury the empire could provide, where her father waited, where what happened next would be something she could never speak of to anyone for the rest of her life. Xerxes was in his late 30s during the years when most of his daughters reached the age he found desirable. He had spent 4 years preparing his massive invasion of Greece, had led the largest army the ancient world had ever seen across the Hellespont on bridges built specifically for that purpose, had won initial victories including the famous stand at Thermopylae where Spartan warriors held a narrow pass until being overwhelmed. He had captured Athens and burned its temples, but he had also suffered catastrophic defeat at Salamis, where the Greek fleet destroyed his naval power, and at Plataea, where his land forces broke and retreated. He returned to Persepolis in 479 BCE, having failed to achieve his grand ambition, having damaged his reputation as the god-king blessed with inevitable victory, having created political vulnerability that made him paranoid about loyalty and desperate to reassert control wherever he could exert it without resistance. His daughters bore the consequences of that desperation. The need to dominate someone, to demonstrate absolute power in the only arena where no one could defeat him, intensified after the Greek failure. Those who had traveled with him on campaign and who had not been distributed as rewards to generals were summoned more frequently after his return. New daughters reaching puberty during these years were initiated earlier and more brutally. The king's use of his daughters became more systematic, more openly discussed in court, as if he was daring anyone to question his divine right to do as he wished with his own family. And no one dared question it, because questioning royal prerogative on something the king clearly wanted was a path to destruction, so obvious that even thinking the wrong thoughts felt dangerous. But there was one daughter whose story reveals the full depths of how Xerxes combined familial power with political calculation in ways that destroyed lives while serving what he considered essential state interests. Her name was Amastris, another bearer of that common royal name. And she was perhaps 12 years old when Xerxes decided to use her in a scheme that demonstrated both his sophistication in political manipulation and his complete disregard for his daughter's humanity. There was a Persian noble named Artabanus who commanded the royal bodyguard, who controlled physical access to the king, who led the troops that could either protect royal power or end it with a single coordinated strike. Artabanus was loyal and competent. But Xerxes understood that the man who protected you could also destroy you, that loyalty without binding ties was just loyalty until circumstances changed. So Xerxes offered Artabanus something that would make betrayal unthinkable: marriage to the young princess Amestris, which would make Artabanus the king's son-in-law, which would give any children from this union royal blood that could potentially be leveraged in future succession crises. It was an enormous honor that Artabanus could not refuse without mortally insulting the king. But before arranging the marriage, before giving his 12-year-old daughter to his bodyguard commander, Xerxes summoned her to his own chambers repeatedly over several months. He used her in ways fathers should not use daughters. He impregnated her with his own child. Then, when she was visibly pregnant, he arranged the marriage to Artabanus, presenting this pregnant child to his most powerful military commander as a wife, forcing Artabanus to accept a bride carrying the king's child, creating a situation where Artabanus would raise as his own son a boy who is actually his wife's half-brother and the king's son-grandson. The political calculation was vicious and brilliant. Artabanus was now bound to Xerxes through multiple overlapping connections that could never be untangled. He was son-in-law. He was raising the king's child as his own. He was deeply complicit in a situation he could never discuss openly, because doing so would acknowledge what the king had done to a child, what he himself had been forced to accept. If Artabanus ever moved against Xerxes, the king could reveal the truth about the boy's parentage, destroying Artabanus's reputation and legitimacy. If Artabanus remained loyal, he would spend his life raising a child who represented his own humiliation and subordination. A living reminder that even commanding the royal bodyguard meant nothing when set against the king's determination to bind you through the most intimate possible violation. For Amestris, the situation was catastrophic in ways that reverberated through her entire life. She had been used by her father, then given to a man who would always see her as both a prize from the king and as evidence of his own powerlessness to refuse royal commands. She would bear a child whose parentage was a lie she would have to maintain for life, whose existence reminded her daily of what her father had done. She would live with a husband who could never fully trust or love her, because she represented his forced complicity in the king's schemes, because every time he looked at the boy he was raising, he would know the truth. Her entire life had been orchestrated to serve her father's political interests, and she had possessed exactly zero agency in any of it. The marriage apparently persisted for years. The child grew up believing Artabanus was his father. Whether Amestris ever told her son the truth, whether Artabanus eventually revealed it during some moment of anger or confession, whether the truth remained buried through Amestris's entire life, the fragmentary sources don't specify. But the fact that Xerxes was willing to do this to his 12-year-old daughter, to impregnate her and then hand her to another man to maintain political control over his bodyguard commander, reveals the absolute depths of how royal power could corrupt family bonds. How little a daughter's well-being mattered when set against political calculation. How the same religious and cultural frameworks that justified fathers claiming daughters could be weaponized to create situations of almost unimaginable cruelty. Another daughter, Artante, found herself caught in a different kind of scandal that revealed to the wider empire what usually remained confined within palace walls. She was perhaps 15 when she caught the attention of Xerxes, Xerxes' brother-in-law, a Persian noble who commanded important military forces and who was married to Xerxes' own sister. The exact nature of their relationship remains unclear in sources, whether it was romantic or simply friendly. But it violated the absolute rule that royal daughters belonged exclusively to their father, until he chose to dispose of them through politically advantageous marriages. When Xerxes discovered this relationship, his response demonstrated the deadly dynamics of power and family twisted by the harem system into something monstrous. He didn't punish Arcane directly, which would have required acknowledging that his daughter had agency enough to choose a relationship, which would have undermined his claim of absolute ownership. Instead, he punished Xerxes' wife, his own sister. Having her mutilated in ways that ancient sources describe with horror, her breasts and nose and ears were cut off, her tongue was removed, her body was destroyed as punishment for her husband's transgression and as a warning about what happened. When anyone interfered with the king's property, as for Arcane herself, she vanished from the historical record after this incident. Whether she was executed, imprisoned, married off to remove her from court, or simply continued living in the harem under stricter supervision, the sources don't tell us. But her disappearance demonstrates that even being the king's daughter provided no real protection when royal power felt threatened. That family connection meant nothing when set against the king's determination to maintain absolute control. That daughters who showed any sign of independent choice simply ceased to exist in ways that left no visible record. When Xerxes was assassinated in his bedchamber in 465 BCE, killed by a conspiracy that may have involved Artabanus himself, the succession crisis that followed brought new horrors to the daughters who had survived their father's reign. Artaxerxes, one of Xerxes' younger sons, emerged victorious from the brutal struggle, killing brothers or forcing them into exile, consolidating power through systematic elimination of threats. Among those threats were his own sisters, Xerxes' daughters. Now women in their 20s and 30s, many married to powerful nobles, some with children, who could potentially claim royal blood and challenge Artaxerxes' legitimacy. The purge that followed was methodical. Sisters married to men Artaxerxes considered disloyal were executed or imprisoned. Others were forced to divorce their husbands and marry supporters of the new king, used once again as political tools exactly as their father had used them. Some died during this period, some disappeared. Some survived by betraying former husbands or children by demonstrating loyalty to Artaxerxes at the cost of every other bond. The daughter I described at the opening, the 13-year-old Amestris who had been prepared with such terrible care for her first night in her father's chambers, survived Xerxes' assassination and the succession crisis. She was married by Artaxerxes to a frontier commander, bore children, fulfilled all expected duties. But fragmentary sources suggest she also maintained networks with other royal women who had survived, creating systems of mutual support among women who shared the experience of being used as instruments by the men in their families. These networks were dangerous because they represented women acting with agency, making choices about loyalty and support that served their own interests rather than simply accepting whatever men decided. Eventually, Artaxerxes decided she had become too independent. Her children were taken and raised in the palace where she couldn't influence them. Her correspondence was monitored. Her movements were restricted. Her contacts with other royal women were systematically severed, isolating each woman so the networks couldn't function. This isolation applied to someone who had endured her father's abuse, who had survived a succession crisis, who had tried to find some agency through solidarity with other women, broke something that even her father's chambers had not quite managed to break. She died at 33, officially from illness. More accurately, from the accumulated psychological destruction of a life spent being used without ever having meaningful choice. The ruins of Persepolis still stand in modern Iran. Massive columns reaching toward the sky. Reliefs showing Persian kings receiving tribute from subject peoples. Staircases where ancient processions once marched. Tourists photograph these ruins and marvel at Persian grandeur without knowing the full stories of what happened in the palace chambers. In the women's quarters where daughters waited to be summoned, in the private spaces where power was exercised without witnesses or restraints. The stones remember what the official records tried to obscure. The columns that still stand held up roofs that covered rooms where 13-year-old girls learned that family bonds meant nothing, that divine blood offered no protection, that being a princess just meant you were valuable enough property to be used carefully. Remember Amastris and Arcane and all the daughters whose names appear in fragmentary sources or who never made it into records at all. They lived in circumstances we struggle to fully imagine. They made choices from among terrible options. They survived or didn't survive systems designed to use them without acknowledging their humanity. Their suffering, documented in accounts preserved across centuries, stands as testimony to what happens when power faces no limits, when one person's desires override all other considerations, when religious and cultural frameworks exist primarily to justify practices that serve the interests of those already holding absolute authority. These dynamics didn't end with ancient Persia. They appear throughout history in different forms. Understanding how they operated in the past helps us recognize them when they appear in the present, helps us see through the justifications that always accompany the exercise of power without accountability. Decades after Xerxes' death, Persian nobles quietly admitted what Greek accounts long claimed. His daughters had been used, known yet unstoppable. No authority intervened. His will was absolute, his desires unquestioned. And even victims believed resisting a divinely sanctioned king was impossible, an offense against the very order of the empire.